They gave me a number the morning of the auction, not a name. Not a title. Just a small paper tag tied around my wrist with white string, the kind you'd use to label a jar of preserved fruit. Lot 17. I stared at it while I sat in a cold waiting room with 11 other Omegas, all of us dressed in pale gray linen, all of us pretending we weren't terrified. I was terrified. I'd been told my whole life that this moment would come. My mother had prepared me for it with the careful, detached efficiency of someone packing a suitcase they didn't want to carry. "You are rare," she used to say, brushing my hair in the evenings when I was young. "Unmated Omegas with your particular scent classification are very rare. Someone powerful will want you. And that is a good thing." She always said it like it was supposed to comfort me. It never did. The thing about being rare is that it doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a target painted on your chest. I was 22 years old. I had a degree in classical literature that no one had ever asked me about. I could recite 3 languages, play 2 instruments, and I once spent an entire winter reading every book in my mother's library just to feel like I had some control over something. None of that mattered here. None of that was on the card they'd prepared for my lot. What mattered was the designation printed in bold at the top: Omega, unmated, unscented, high compatibility rating, 9.4, a 9.4. They'd scored me like a piece of real estate. The waiting room smelled like artificial lavender and anxiety. The Omega beside me, a boy who couldn't have been older than 19, with wide brown eyes and hands that wouldn't stop trembling, kept looking at the door like he was calculating whether he could run. I understood the impulse. I'd done the same math at least a dozen times since they'd brought me here 3 days ago. The answer was always the same. You couldn't run. The contracts were legal. The system was older than anyone living. And unmated Omegas didn't survive long on their own anyway. The biological reality of our designation made sure of that, as cruel as any prison. Lot 17, a voice called from the doorway. I stood up. My legs were steadier than I expected. I'd thought they'd shake. But something cold and quiet had settled into me somewhere during those 3 days of waiting, and I walked toward the door with my chin level and my hands loose at my sides, because the only dignity I had left was how I carried myself into the room. The auction hall was not what I'd imagined. I think I'd pictured something shameful and dark, a backroom transaction conducted in shadows. Instead it was bright. White marble floors, high ceilings, warm lighting arranged like a gallery. There were perhaps 40 people seated in tiered rows, all of them alphas or high-ranking betas. All of them dressed in the kind of expensive understatement that only truly wealthy people can afford. They turned to look at me the moment I stepped through the door. I kept my eyes forward. The auctioneer, a small man in a gray suit, was already speaking, his voice smooth and practiced, the way a sommelier describes a wine. He listed my attributes the way you'd list the features of a house. Age. Health rating. Scent classification. Compatibility index. Years of secondary education. Reproductive viability score, which made my stomach turn. I stood on the low platform at the front of the room and stared at a point on the far wall just above the heads of the crowd, and I thought about the last chapter of the book I'd been reading before they took me. I thought about the ending I hadn't gotten to yet. I thought about anything except what was happening. The bidding started at a number that would have bought a large piece of land in the countryside. Within 2 minutes, it had nearly doubled. I could hear the numbers climbing in my peripheral awareness, but I refused to track them. I refused to look at the faces behind them. I existed somewhere slightly outside my own body, watching from a careful distance, which was the only way I knew how to get through things like this. Then everything went quiet, not literally. The room still had its ambient sounds, the rustle of movement, the soft tap of someone entering late from the back. But the bidding stopped. I felt it before I understood it, a sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, like a barometric pressure change before a storm. Going once, the auctioneer said, and his voice had changed slightly. A thread of something different in it. Going twice, I finally looked at the room. He was standing at the back. I don't know why he was standing instead of sitting. Everyone else was seated, but he stood with the easy stillness of someone who had never once in his life needed to announce his own presence. Tall. Dark coat. Dark hair that was slightly too long and slightly too unruly to be entirely intentional. He had the kind of face that was difficult to look away from. Not because it was perfect but because it was specific, a strong jaw, a sharp brow, a mouth that sat in a neutral line that could have been calm or could have been cold, and I couldn't tell which. His eyes were already on me, not on the auctioneer. Not on his phone or his program. On me, sold, the auctioneer said. The name they called was Von Drake. Here is what I expected Von Drake to do. I expected him to come to the collection room with the proprietary confidence of every alpha who'd ever won something. I expected him to circle me the way buyers circle livestock, checking the goods against the catalog description. I expected him to touch my wrist to confirm my scent, which was his legal right as the contract holder. I expected him to say something like "you'll do well" or "I have certain expectations" or any number of the phrases I'd been mentally bracing myself for since the moment his name was called. Here is what Von Drake actually did. He walked into the collection room, and he stopped in the doorway, and he looked at me for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned to the contract administrator, a thin woman with a clipboard and reading glasses, and said, "I need this processed quickly. I have somewhere to be." The woman nodded and began the paperwork. Von Drake sat down in one of the chairs along the wall, pulled out a small book from his coat pocket, and started reading. He just started reading. I stood in the middle of the room with my hands clasped in front of me, dressed in the gray linen they'd put me in, with my paper tag still tied to my wrist, and I watched this man read a book while the woman processed the contract that bound me to him, and I had absolutely no framework for what was happening. He didn't look up until the administrator asked him to sign. He signed. He took the duplicate copy, folded it, and tucked it into his coat without looking at it. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and finally looked at me again. "Edwin Henson," he said, "not Lot 17. My name." "Yes," I said, and my voice came out steadier than it had any right to be. "My car is outside. Do you have any belongings here?" They didn't allow us to bring anything. Something moved in his expression, fast, and then gone, like a fish beneath dark water. "Then let's go," he said. I followed him out. The car was dark and warm and smelled faintly of old paper and something underneath that I couldn't quite identify, something that my designation recognized instinctively and catalogued with a low, unwilling hum of interest that I firmly ignored. Von Drake sat across from me. The car was large enough for facing seats, and looked out the window. He did not speak for a long time. I did not speak either. I had learned early that silence was a test, and that the only way to pass it was not to fill it. We drove for perhaps 20 minutes before he said, without turning from the window, "I want to explain why I was there today." "You don't have to explain anything to me," I said. "The contract is clear." He did turn then. Those eyes, gray, I could see now, very light gray, the color of winter sky, settled on me with a focus that was almost uncomfortable. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." I waited. "I was informed 3 weeks ago that you would be on this auction," he said. "By someone who wanted you to end up with someone particularly unpleasant. They asked me not to bid, actually. Which is why I did." I stared at him. "I have no interest in contract ownership," he continued, in the same even tone. "I'm telling you this so you understand that what happens next is not. I am not going to exercise any of the terms of that contract." The car was very quiet. "Then what are you going to do with it?" I asked. He reached into his coat and took out the folded contract. He held it out to me across the space between us. "Give it to you," he said. I didn't take the contract immediately. I stared at it, at his hand, extended across the car, holding those folded papers, for what was probably an embarrassing length of time. The contract was standard size. White paper, official seal. His signature in black ink at the bottom. My entire legal existence for the foreseeable future, summarized on 2 pages. "You're serious," I said. "I'm always serious," he said. He wasn't being unkind. He sounded like someone stating a simple fact about themselves. "Take it." I took it. It felt strange in my hands. Lighter than it should have been for something that had weighed so heavily over me for the past 3 years, ever since my status was classified and my mother began her quiet campaign of preparation. I turned it over once, then folded it back the way it had been and held it in my lap. "Where are we going?" I asked. "My house," he said. "You can stay there while you figure out what you want to do. The contract lists my address as your registered residence for the next 6 months regardless. It's administrative, it can't be changed immediately. But the space is yours. I have plenty of room." "Why?" I asked. The question came out more bluntly than I intended. Why any of this? You spent a significant amount of money today. You intervened in something that didn't directly involve you. You're offering me a room in your house. Why? He turned back to the window. For a moment I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, quietly, because someone should have, I didn't know what to do with that. So I looked out my own window and watched the city give way to quieter streets, and I held my contract in my lap, and I tried to understand what kind of world I had just stepped into. His house was not what I expected, though by that point I should have stopped expecting anything. I had prepared myself for something imposing. Something that announced wealth and status the way the men in that auction room had. With clean lines and expensive emptiness. Instead the house was old, genuinely, comfortably old, the kind of old that means lived in rather than neglected. Wide wooden floors that creaked slightly. Books on every available surface. A kitchen that smelled like someone actually cooked in it. A garden visible through the back windows, overgrown in a way that suggested deliberate neglect rather than abandonment, as though the wildness was intentional. He showed me to a room on the second floor. Large windows, a bed with actual quilts rather than the decorator kind, a writing desk under the window with a small lamp. The bathroom is across the hall, he said. There's food in the kitchen. Take whatever you want. My schedule is irregular, so don't plan around me. If you need anything, ask, I'll answer honestly. If you'd rather not speak to me, that's also fine. He was already turning to leave. Vaughn, I said, and then stopped, because I hadn't planned to say anything, and I certainly hadn't planned to use his first name. He paused in the doorway and looked back. Thank you, I said. It felt inadequate. It was inadequate. But it was what I had. He studied me for a moment. Sleep, he said. You look like you haven't in days. He left. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time after that. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, and I put the contract on the desk. And I looked at it, and I let myself feel, for the first time since they'd taken me to that facility, the entire weight of the past 3 days. The waiting room. The gray linen. The paper tag. The auction hall with its gallery lighting and its civilized horror, and then, his name, called out. And his hand, extending the contract. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and breathed. I did not cry. But it was a very near thing. I discovered that Vaughn Drake woke up at 7 in the morning and made terrible coffee, not bad coffee, terrible coffee. The kind that made you question whether the person making it had ever actually enjoyed the beverage. Thick, slightly burnt. In a large gray mug that he carried around the house with the contentment of someone who genuinely believed it was good. I'd been in his house for 4 days. In those 4 days, I had learned the following things about him. 1. He worked from home, in a study on the ground floor with a door that was sometimes closed and sometimes open, and when it was open I could hear the occasional sound of him on a call, his voice low and precise and completely devoid of the performance that most powerful alphas put into telephone conversations. 2. He owned more books than any single person reasonably needed, and they were not organized by author or title or color, but in some system I couldn't decode that nonetheless seemed to make perfect sense to him. Because he always found what he was looking for immediately. 3. He cooked actual meals, not elaborate ones, but real ones, with ingredients rather than convenience products, and he left portions in the refrigerator without fanfare or comment, in a way that made it easy to take them without it feeling like charity. 4. His scent, which I was involuntarily cataloging with the relentless accuracy of my biology, was cedar and something darker, something that lived low in the chest. I was ignoring this with the focused determination of an athlete. On the 4th morning, I came downstairs to find him in the kitchen making his terrible coffee, and he looked up and said, without preamble, "Can you cook?" "Yes," I said, because I could. I was actually reasonably good at it. "Then teach me how to make coffee properly," he said, which was not what I'd expected him to say. "I've been making it this way for 12 years and I've recently started to suspect something is wrong." I looked at his mug. "What tipped you off? You made a face the first morning," he said. "I didn't." I started, and then stopped, because I had made a face. I'd thought it was subtle. The corner of his mouth moved. It was very nearly a smile. "Teach me," he said, so I taught him to make coffee. It was such a small thing. Standing in his kitchen in the early morning, walking him through the ratio and the temperature and the timing. Him watching with the same focused attention he seemed to give everything, asking questions that were surprisingly specific for someone who had apparently been immune to coffee feedback for over a decade. Afterward, he drank the new version and was quiet for a moment. "That's different," he said. "Better, yes." He looked at his mug. "I've been drinking it wrong for 12 years, most people assume they're doing things right when no one corrects them," I said. He looked at me then, that steady, precise attention, and I had the distinct feeling we were no longer talking about coffee. "Sit down," he said. "I want to talk to you about something." I sat across from him at the kitchen table. The morning light was coming in sideways through the windows and the house was very quiet. "The person who told me about your auction," he said. "His name is Cresswell. He runs a network of contract holders in this region, and he has been, systematically, acquiring omegas with rare classifications. Not for himself. For placement. The contracts are sold on, privately, to a closed group of buyers." My hands were very still on the table. "I know some of this," I said carefully. "How much?" "I know there are rumors. I know that some omegas who go through standard auctions end up, somewhere that isn't where the public contract says they are." I paused. "I know that Cresswell's name comes up in those rumors." "It's more than rumors," Vaughn said. His voice was level but there was something underneath it, a controlled quality that spoke to effort. "I've been building a case against him for 2 years. Your auction was part of a specific transaction. He had a buyer already lined up, someone outside the standard oversight framework. When I heard you were in the system, I went." "Who told you specifically about me?" "Someone inside Cresswell's network who is helping me." He met my eyes. "I'm not asking you to be involved in any of this, Edwin. I want to be clear about that. You're free to go whenever you want. The administrative residency requirement is a technicality and I have lawyers who can navigate it. But I thought you deserved to know the full context of why you were at that auction, and why I was there." The morning light. The coffee getting cooler between my hands. The weight of what he was telling me, settling into my chest like something I had always known but never been given words for. "The buyer who was lined up for me," I said. "Who was it?" He was quiet for a moment. "His name would mean nothing to you," he said. "Tell me anyway." He did. It meant nothing to me. He was right about that. But the way Vaughn said it, careful, like someone setting down something heavy, told me everything I needed to know about what that contract would have meant. "I see," I said. We were quiet for a moment. "Thank you," I said, for the second time. It still felt inadequate. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "Cresswell knows someone outbid his buyer. He'll know it was me. Which means this situation is not," he paused. "I don't want you to feel like you've walked out of one constraint and into another. But I want you to understand your circumstances fully." I looked at him across the table. "The morning between us." His gray eyes steady and serious, and something else, something careful, that I wasn't ready to name yet. "I appreciate that," I said. "Most people in your position would not have told me any of that." "I know," he said simply. 2 weeks in. I stopped counting the days. This was significant. Since I'd been classified at 19, I had counted everything: days until the next assessment, days since my last heat suppressant, days remaining on the administrative review that determined my auction eligibility. My life had been a series of countdowns to things I dreaded. In Vaughn's house, the days just passed, and I let them. I found a rhythm. Mornings in the kitchen, making the coffee correctly now, while Vaughn read whatever he was reading. Afternoons in my room, working through his library with an enthusiasm that probably said too much about how long I'd been denied access to books. Evenings were variable. Sometimes he worked late and I barely saw him. Sometimes we ended up in the sitting room after dinner, each of us reading, the fire going if the nights were cold. We talked, in the way that people who are careful with words sometimes talk, not continuously but deeply, when something worth saying came up. He asked about my education, and then actually listened to the answers. I asked about his work. And he explained it without the condescension that alphas often employed when explaining their world to omegas. He spoke to me like I was an equal, which was not something I had experienced often enough to take for granted. I was learning him in pieces. He didn't sleep enough. He remembered everything. He was more patient with people he disagreed with than with people who were careless. Carelessness bothered him in a way that disagreement didn't. He had a dry humor that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. and when something genuinely amused him the expression on his face was completely different from his ordinary composure, lighter and younger and startlingly warm. He was also, I was increasingly and inconveniently aware, the most compelling person I had ever been in a room with. I was handling this by not thinking about it. It was working poorly. 3 weeks in, I was in the study, not his, mine, of sorts. He gestured toward the library at the back of the house one afternoon and said, "Use this room if you want space to work," with the same matter-of-fact casualness he applied to all generosity, and I had begun spending my afternoons there. It had a large table and good lamps and bookshelves along every wall, and it smelled like paper and cedar and that undercurrent I was still not acknowledging. I was working on something. In my pre-auction life I'd written academic papers. Analysis, a few things that were more personal, letters I'd never sent. I'd thought that part of me had been put away somewhere for safekeeping, stored away with all the other things that hadn't fit into the shape my life had been assigned. But sitting in that library, surrounded by books, I felt it coming back, the need to put words together, to make meaning out of things. I was writing when Vaughn appeared in the doorway. "You're still up," he said. It was late, past 11, the house dark except for my lamp. "So are you," I said. He came in and looked at the papers on the table without reading them, which I appreciated. "What are you working on?" "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. "Something. It doesn't have a shape yet." He nodded like that was a completely acceptable answer. He crossed to one of the bookshelves, found something, and then, instead of leaving, sat down in the chair on the other side of the table. "Do you mind?" he asked. "No," I said, and I meant it more than 2 letters should carry. We worked in silence for a while. The lamp between us. The quiet house. His presence across the table, which I was aware of in the particular way that had become familiar over the past 3 weeks, a low, constant warmth, like sitting near a fire without looking directly at it. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said, without planning to. He looked up. "Yes, why don't you have a mate?" I asked, and then immediately wondered if I should have said that. "I'm sorry. That's none of my business, it's a reasonable question," he said. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "The honest answer is that I've never wanted to own someone." He paused. "The Alpha-Omega contract system is, I have fundamental objections to it. My own designation makes people assume certain things about what I want. Those assumptions are usually wrong." I looked at him. "You bought the contract at that auction," I said. "I did." He held my gaze. "Specifically so I could give it to you." He paused. It was the only mechanism available to me in that room. The fire was low. The lamp was warm. I was very aware of the particular silence between us, the quality of it, and if you could have done it differently. I asked quietly. "I'd have burned the entire system down," he said, and it was so flat and certain that I believed him completely. I looked at the papers in front of me. The words I'd been writing, that didn't have a shape yet. "Vaughn," I said. "Yes, I want you to know." I stopped. Started again. "Being here. What you've done. It's given me something back that I didn't think I'd ever get to keep." I looked up at him. "I don't know how to say it properly. But I wanted you to know." He was very still. "Edwin," he said. And the way he said my name, not Lot 17, not the Omega, my name, the way he'd said it from the very first moment, did something complicated to the region of my chest. "Yes, I'm glad you're here," he said, simple. Quiet. Completely sincere. I went back to my writing, because I needed somewhere to put the feeling that gave me, and he went back to his book, and we stayed there in the lamplight for another hour without speaking, and it was one of the best hours I could remember having. If you are still watching, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's see what happens next. I should have seen it coming. I'd been on suppressants for 3 years, since my classification. Since my mother began preparing me for the market. The suppressants were standard protocol for Unmated Omega's pending auction, to prevent complications and maintain the commercial viability of the classification assessment. They weren't harmful exactly, but they were pervasive, adjusting the body's rhythms like a hand on a clock. I'd run out 2 weeks ago. I hadn't thought about it properly. The suppressants came through the official system, through the facility, and when I left that world I left its supply chain too. I'd told myself I had more time. I'd told myself I'd figure it out. I'd been distracted by books and coffee and late evenings in the library and the growing, low-grade warmth of a presence I was trying very hard not to let myself want. Then I woke up one morning and my body had made its own decision. I lay in my bed for approximately 2 minutes telling myself it wasn't happening, and then I gave up, because there are certain biological realities that don't negotiate. I was burning up and it had nothing to do with temperature. I made it to the bathroom, ran cold water, pressed my wrists under the tap. The world was too warm. My skin felt like it didn't fit. Everything was heightened: sound, light, the smell of the house, which was cedar and paper, and something deeper that I needed with a clarity that was completely humiliating. I sat on the bathroom floor with cold water still running into the sink above me and tried to think logically. Options: I could stay here and ride it out alone, which was unpleasant and took approximately 3 days and would be extremely obvious to an alpha in the same house. I could ask Vaughn for assistance, I wasn't ready to think about that. I could leave the house, which presented its own complications given that my registration was here and I had nowhere to go and Cresswell was still a problem. While I was thinking about this, there was a knock on the bathroom door. I closed my eyes. Edwin. His voice through the door, carefully neutral. I know what's happening. You don't have to explain. I just want to know that you're all right. My voice came out strange. I cleared my throat. I'm fine. A pause. You don't sound fine, he said, and it was not unkind, just honest. Vaughn, I said, and I was mortified by how rough my voice was. Please don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not trying to, he said. I'm trying to ask what you need, what I need. The words went through me like something physical. I need this to not be happening, I said. That's not something I can provide, he said, and there was something in it, something careful and human. What can I actually provide? I pressed my back against the cabinet under the sink. The cold tiles of the floor. The steady running water. His voice on the other side of the door. I stopped. I don't want to ask you for something you don't want to give, Edwin. His voice was steady, quiet. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. Nothing happens here unless you choose it. Nothing. I have a guest room on the ground floor with a sealed door if you want distance. I have suppressants in my medicine cabinet, secondary grade, not ideal but functional, if you want an alternative. Or, a pause. Or I'm right here. All of those are real options. None of them come with obligation: the cold floor. The running water. The voice I've been falling in love with for 3 weeks saying all of those are real options. The suppressants won't work properly now. I said. The windows passed. I know, he said quietly. Vaughn, yes, can you? I stopped. Can you open the door? There was a moment of silence. Then the door opened, slowly, and he was there. He'd clearly just woken up, his hair was more disheveled than usual, and he was in a dark sweater, and he looked at me on the floor and the expression on his face was something I had no name for. Not pity. Not the proprietary interest of an alpha finding what they wanted. Something softer and more careful than either of those things. He sat down on the floor across from me. Hi, he said. Hi, I said, and somehow I almost laughed, which I hadn't expected. Tell me what you want, he said. Just that. Just simply, directly, like it was the most natural question in the world, and sitting on a cold bathroom floor. Burning and frightened and more certain about one thing than I had been about anything in my life, I told him. Afterward, the house was very quiet. I was in his room, his actual room, with his window and his lamp and his specific smell that was no longer just background information but something I had pressed my face against with complete abandon, which I was choosing not to be embarrassed about. The first light was coming in at the edges of the curtains. He was asleep beside me. I lay on my side and looked at him, which felt like something I was allowed to do now. His face in sleep was less composed than his waking face, softer, younger. His hair was completely catastrophic. There was a line along his jaw that I had, in the past few hours, learned with my fingers and intended to learn again at the first opportunity. I felt, for the first time in years, like my body was my own, not rented or catalogued or assigned a compatibility score. Mine. This moment, in this particular light, with this particular person who had bought a contract and handed it to me and sat on bathroom floors and said tell me what you want like it was simple, like I had always been someone whose wants mattered. I was not naive. I knew what came next was complicated. The contract situation was still legally in flux. Cresswell was still a problem. My future was still uncertain in ways that would take months to untangle. Nothing about the world outside this room had changed, but something about me had changed. Vaughn's eyes opened. He had that quality that some people do, of waking up completely, no gradual surfacing, just suddenly present, his gray eyes clear and direct. He looked at me looking at him. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," I said. A pause. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and I meant it specifically and entirely. "Are you?" Something moved in his expression. That warmth I'd seen in the library, that younger and lighter version of him. "Yes," he said. We were quiet. The light was changing slowly at the curtains. "Vaughn," I said, I want to be clear about something." He turned his head to look at me more fully. Listening, as he always listened, like what I was about to say was the thing that mattered most. "I'm not. What happened last night isn't something I'm going to fold into a category of things that happen during heats and aren't discussed afterward," I said. "I don't want that. I took a breath. I want to know what this is. What you want it to be." His gaze was steady on mine. "Edwin," he said. "I walked into an auction 2 months ago because I heard your name and I couldn't not go. I have been sitting in rooms with you trying to be appropriate, careful, because you came from something that took away your choices and I refuse to be another thing that does that." He paused. "What I want is," he stopped, and for the first time I saw something like uncertainty in him, a crack in the careful composure. "I want to ask you things and have you actually be free to say no. I want to make terrible coffee at you until you teach me to make it better. I want you to fill my library with paper covered in your writing. I want," he stopped again. "Go on," I said softly. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of the contract. Not because of the registration. Because you want to, the morning light." "I want to stay," I said. He reached out and tucked a piece of my hair behind my ear, which was an absurdly gentle gesture for a man who presented as perpetually composed. And I decided then that I was completely and irrevocably gone on him, and I was fine with that. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed to Vaughn, but he brought it to the kitchen and set it on the table between us with the look of someone who has been expecting something unpleasant and is choosing to address it directly rather than sidestep it. I read it. It was from Cresswell's legal office. In the language of formal correspondence and official courtesy, it communicated several things: that the lot from the recent auction had been identified as subject to a prior informal agreement, that the current contract holder was invited to discuss a reassignment arrangement, that failure to engage with this process would result in a formal challenge to the validity of the original sale on procedural grounds. And that the compensation offered would be generous. I set it down. "He's not going to stop," I said. "No," Vaughn agreed. "He's not. What does this actually mean legally?" Vaughn sat down across from me. "He has a weak procedural case. The sale was entirely valid. But a legal challenge, even a losing one, would put your name in the system again, which would flag you for reassessment, there are mechanisms in the reassessment process that he has people inside. It's not about winning in court. It's about creating an opportunity." The coffee was hot in my hands. Outside the window the garden was its usual deliberate wildness. "Tell me about your case against him," I said. "Edwin, I know you said you don't want me involved," I said. "But I am already involved. I was almost a piece of evidence in his network. Tell me." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he got up, went to the study, and came back with a file. He told me everything. Cresswell ran a private network, old money, old connections, old assumptions about what omegas were for. He'd been operating for years through the entirely legal mechanism of the contract system, using legitimate auctions as a front for a secondary market that was very much not legitimate. He had buyers who wanted specific classifications for specific purposes that Vaughn described in clipped, careful language that nonetheless made the back of my neck cold. Vaughn had 2 years of documentation, witness accounts, financial trails. What he didn't have was a way to move it forward without triggering Cresswell's legal and political connections, which were substantial enough to bury a case before it reached anyone who would act on it. "What do you need?" I asked. "The buyer who was lined up for you," Vaughn said. He met my eyes. A direct statement. From someone who was designated for that transaction, about what the transaction was and what it was intended for. That's the piece that makes the financial trail mean something. I understood, you need me, I said. I am not asking you, he said immediately. This is not why I brought you here. This is not what any of this, Vaughn. I said his name quietly and he stopped. I know. I know you're not asking. I looked at the file on the table. I'm offering, he was very still, there is real risk in this, he said. Cresswell has resources and he is not, he doesn't respond to being cornered with grace. I know, Edwin, I know, I said again. But you sat on a bathroom floor and asked me what I needed. The least I can do is help you dismantle the thing that put me on that bathroom floor. I held his gaze. Let me be part of this. He looked at me for a long time, and I could see the argument happening in him, the part that wanted to protect me against the part that understood I was not asking to be protected. All right, he said finally. But we do it carefully. And if at any point it becomes, I'll tell you, I said. I'll actually tell you. I promise. He nodded once, then, quietly, thank you, don't thank me yet, I said, which was almost exactly what he'd said to me in the car on the day we met, and the recognition of it moved across his face like light. The next 6 weeks were not simple. They were not simple in the sense that my days now included being coached by Vaughn's legal team, reviewing documentation, giving recorded statements, and navigating the particular anxiety of being someone who Cresswell had reason to pursue. They were also not simple in the sense that Vaughn and I were discovering what we were. Which is a process that is never entirely straightforward, particularly when both people involved have reasons to be careful about what they let themselves want. We were careful with each other. We were also increasingly incapable of being as careful as we intended. There was a night during the 4th week when I came back from a particularly draining session with the legal team, and I sat down on the kitchen floor, not the bathroom floor this time, but the kitchen floor, with my back against the cabinet, and I was just tired. The deep kind of tired that isn't about sleep. Vaughn found me there. He came in from the study, stopped when he saw me, and without saying anything came and sat down beside me. Our shoulders touching. His presence warm and solid and steady. Bad day, he said. They kept asking me to repeat the catalog description, I said. From the auction. My own designation, my scores, all of it. For the record. For the documentation. I looked at my hands. I know why they need it. I know it's necessary. It reduces you, he said quietly. Yes, he turned and looked at me, and then he said something I wasn't expecting. When I walked into that auction, he said, the auctioneer was describing you. And the thing I remember most is not the numbers. He paused. I remember thinking, he looks like he's somewhere else. Like he'd found a way to not be in that room. A pause. I wanted to know where that place was. I looked at him. Where were you? He said softly. That day, on that platform. Where did you go? I thought about it. The end of a book, I said. I'd been reading something before they brought me in, and I hadn't finished it, and I was trying to write the ending myself. In my head, what was the ending? I didn't know, I said. That was the problem. I could never decide. He was quiet for a moment. Edwin, he said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be careful about how you receive it. I need you to just hear it. I turned to face him fully. All right, I love you, he said. Not as a consequence of circumstances. Not because of what we've been through or what's happening with Cresswell or because of the night you asked me to open the bathroom door. I love the way you read. I love that you know when I need silence and when I need to be asked questions. I love that you argued with me for 40 minutes about a novel's ending and then admitted I was right about it. I love that you offer yourself to things that frighten you because it's the right thing to do. He held my gaze. I need you to know that, the kitchen floor. The quiet house. The warm press of his shoulder against mine. Vaughn, I said, yes, I've been in love with you, I said, since the morning you admitted you'd been making coffee wrong for 12 years and wanted help. I paused. Which is a ridiculous reason to fall in love with someone. It's a perfectly good reason, he said, and his voice was rough at the edges, and then his forehead was against mine, and we stayed like that for a while, on the kitchen floor in the quiet house, which was exactly where we were supposed to be. The formal legal proceeding was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, Vaughn had been in 3 preparatory meetings the day before, and I had revised my statement 4 times, and the legal team had done everything that could be done. And still the morning of, I stood in the kitchen in my good clothes and felt the particular cold clarity of someone walking towards something that could go several ways. Vaughn came in and looked at me. "Ready?" he said. "No," I said honestly. "But let's go." He paused at the door and turned back, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He reached out and straightened the collar of my jacket, his fingers brief and precise, and then he held my gaze. "Whatever happens in there," he said. "Whatever the outcome today, the outcome between us doesn't change. I need you to know that before we walk in." I put my hand over his, briefly. "I know," I said. We walked in. I won't recount every detail of the hearing. It was long and formal, and there were several moments when I genuinely couldn't tell which way it was going. Cresswell was there, seated on the opposite side with his legal team, and he looked at me once across the room with the particular expression of someone who has never considered that the people in their network were ever really people. I gave my statement. I kept my voice steady. I said what I knew, what I had been designated for, what the transaction had been intended to produce. I said it clearly and completely and without flinching, because I had promised Vaughn I would, and because every Omega who had gone through that network deserved someone to say it out loud in a room that was required to listen. The case was not concluded that day. These things never are, not fully. But by the end of the hearing, Cresswell's procedural challenge against the contract had been dismissed. His legal team's attempt to reopen auction records was denied. The investigation was referred to a body with actual authority over the network he ran. It was not everything. It was something. Outside afterward, Vaughn stood beside me on the steps while our legal team spoke to each other. The air was cold and bright. "It's not finished," I said. "No," he agreed, "but it started." "Yes," I looked at the sky. "There are other Omegas," I said. "Other lots. Other numbers." "I know," he said quietly. "We'll work on it." He paused. "Together, if you want, together." The word sat between us with a particular weight, the kind that comes from something chosen rather than assigned. "Together," I said. 3 months later, I burned the contract. It was a deliberate, slightly ceremonial decision that Vaughn had fully supported and gently suggested making into an actual occasion. So on a Friday evening, he built a small fire in the fireplace, and I retrieved the folded papers from my desk where they'd lived since the day in the car, and I sat on the floor in front of the fire and looked at them one more time. Lot number 17. Omega. Unmated. Unscented. High compatibility rating. 9.4. I thought about the waiting room. The gray linen. The paper tag. The auction hall with its gallery lighting and its terrible, civilized performance of commerce. The auctioneer's practiced voice listing my attributes like real estate. I thought about a man standing at the back of the room, already looking at me. I thought about a car. A hand, extending papers across the space between us. "Give it to you." I put the contract in the fire. It burned cleanly, quickly. A few seconds and it was gone, and the only copy of that document in the world was ash, and I was just Edwin Henson. No lot number. No compatibility score. No designation printed in bold at the top of anyone's paperwork, just Edwin. Vaughn sat down beside me on the floor, as he had a habit of doing, and we watched the last of it burn. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "Like something finished," I said. "And like something else is just starting." He turned and looked at me, and the firelight was warm on his face, and he had that expression, the lighter, younger one, the one that appeared when something genuinely pleased him. "Good," he said softly. "That's exactly right." I leaned my head against his shoulder. Outside, the garden was wild and dark and entirely its own. The fire was warm. The house was full of books. Somewhere in my room, on my writing desk, there were pages covered in words that were becoming a thing with a shape. And I was home, not the home that gets assigned to you. Not the address on a contract or the facility where they put numbered tags on your wrist. The kind of home that you find in the exact specific place where someone looked at you and said, "What do you want?" and meant it. That kind, the only kind that counts. Spring came back to the garden and did what it always does, which is find all the things that survived the winter. I was on the back steps with my notebook and my coffee, made correctly, a point of ongoing personal pride, When Vaughn came out and sat beside me with the post and the look of someone who has found something mildly interesting in the correspondence, "You have a letter," he said, and handed it to me. It was from the legal team. The proceeding against Cresswell's network had concluded. Multiple counts. Multiple outcomes. The secondary market, as it had operated for years, was formally dismantled. There was a long section about the establishment of a new oversight body, and the names of several Omegas who had provided supporting accounts, many of whom I had spoken to over the past months as the case developed. I read it twice, then I put it down and looked at the garden. "It's done," I said. "Yes," Vaughn said. The morning was warm and green and full of bird sound. In the corner of the garden there was a rosebush that had been doing its own thing for years and this spring had apparently decided to perform. Covered in something large and red that had no business being that dramatic. "I've been thinking," I said. "I know," he said. He always knew when I was thinking about something specific. I had stopped being surprised by this. "The writing I've been doing," I said. "I think it's a book. About, not exactly this. Something that borrows from this and goes somewhere else. I think I want to actually write it properly." "I know," he said again. I looked at him. "You knew before I did. You've been circling it for 3 months. The corner of his mouth moved. "Your pacing pattern changed." "I do not have a pacing pattern." "You absolutely have a pacing pattern." I considered arguing and then decided it would be faster to move on. "Anyway," I said. "I wanted to tell you." He reached over without looking and covered my hand with his thumb drawing a slow line across my knuckles, and said nothing, because he knew when I needed silence. I picked up my notebook. The garden performed its extravagance in the morning light. The rosebush continued its dramatic spring display without apology, and I began to write. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next story.